Welcome to this ASQ webcast presentation on Process and RPA, the must-haves, how to start your RPA journey. I'm Pablo Baez with ASQ, and today we have with us Sheila Shaffie. Now, a little bit about Sheila before we get things started. Sheila is a process geek at heart with over 20 years of business transformation and process management experience. She's honed her skills at 3 General Electric businesses: plastics, healthcare, and capital. And she's the co-founder of ProcessArc and the trusted partner of financial institutions around the globe who she's helped with discovering their potential for growth and improved client experience. A sample list of her clients include Thomson Reuters, Ally Financial, Exact Sciences, GMAC, and R.W. Baird. And she holds an MBA from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Waterloo. She is GE Six Sigma Green Belt, Black Belt, and Master Black Belt certified. She has received additional training in GE's technical leadership and management development programs, as well as in the change acceleration process and the CAP facilitation. Today, Sheila will offer a wonderful presentation on robotic process automation and how it can substantially improve your client's experience and their bottom line. All right, with that, let me pass it over to Sheila to get things started.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you everyone for listening to our webinar today. With the 4th Industrial Revolution upon us, it's no surprise that the only thing advancing faster than technology is consumer expectations. Your customers want what they want when they want it. The name of the game is speed, empowerment, and convenience. What I'm hoping we will accomplish in the next 20 minutes is how RPA will fit into this ever-evolving paradigm. Here's what's happening in the industry. As a means to keep up with client expectations and growth, a significant % of organizations are pursuing digital transformation. Based on a 2018 survey, roughly 70% of companies are undergoing transformation. Of course, that means different paths to different companies, from implementation of RPA to digitized application taking process to leveraging workflow systems to aid data flow. But regardless of the path, the end expectations are the same. Take cost out and make it easier to do business with. Before we dive into how to make RPA implementation successful and the pitfalls to avoid, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss RPA's capabilities. This is important as the terms AI, which is artificial intelligence, on RPA are sometimes used interchangeably, and they're definitely not the same thing. Crudely speaking, RPA is about doing, and AI is about thinking. RPA takes a piece of the process that's highly manual and automates it, and AI takes millions of data points to predict or make decisions. RPA is a computer-based software that takes over simple, repetitive tasks. And to do that, it can open attachments, log into applications, scrape data off applications and forms and copy it into other systems, make calculations, and so on. The computer-coded software is capable of mimicking many, if not most, human user actions, as long as they're logical and rule-based. That's the key. If your process has a lot of what, if, then steps, or is highly customized, then RPA is most likely not a good fit. How can RPA support the digital transformation journey? Well, according to PwC report, roughly 45% of current manual work can be automated through RPA. That's good news given the strengths of this automation tool. Starting with the cost, RPA typically runs at 33% of the cost of an offshore resource and 10% of onshore. Because the process is being completed by code instead of people who once in a while make errors, the chance of making mistakes become virtually zero. When things get done by code, the spikes in volume and the cyclical nature of business become less relevant. Processing time can go from hours and days to minutes or seconds, and the actual implementation time can be weeks, making the ROI over 300%. And finally, its non-invasive nature is what makes it truly appealing, as it doesn't disrupt any of the underlying systems. But we're not here to sell you on RPA, but rather give you the whole picture so that you are fully armed with all the data in order to make good decisions. And like anything else in life, with the good comes some bad. And with all the strengths and benefits of RPA, there's also some challenges. Number one item for us is process standardization. In order for RPA to really work, it has to take over repetitive tasks, which means that the input to the process has to be consistent, the processing itself has to be standard, as do the outcomes. So think of an actual robot on a manufacturing floor of a car company. Each car is built on its own assembly line. All the parts are standardized, and the location of the bolts are exactly the same. So the robot doesn't have to think. It's been programmed to pick up the exact same bolt every time and place it on exactly the same location for every car on that assembly line. The same goes with RPA in a transactional environment. Your process has to be simplified and standardized in order for it to work. RPA will be programmed to do exactly the same thing every time. There is no thinking. One of the highest risks with RPA implementation is applying the technology to a process that results in a lot of exceptions. An example may be an insurance application. If the application is not filled out as it needs to be in its entirety, then once it enters the RPA stage, the code will look for all the required data so it can transpose it from paper to system. If the required data is not filled out on the form, then it will kick it out for a human to process it. That's an exception. And in that case, we don't gain any benefits from RPA. Processes that are not cleaned up, standardized, and simplified will result in low ROIs. And of course, we need to get IT buy-in. While RPA initiatives are most often led by the business, IT involvement is critical, especially in the implementation, testing, and going live phases. The challenge is that IT resources are typically deployed on larger scale items and responsible for keeping on the lights. The integration aspect is critical if you're considering using RPA at multiple points in the process or the business. In those cases, governance and control will become an additional element to consider. Another way of saying it is, who is going to control all the robots deployed in the business? And the final points really go hand in hand: key stakeholder buy-in and employee impact. Because to effectively get buy-in from the key stakeholders and the subject matter experts whose input we will need, there has to be a clear vision and expected deliverables mapped out. The change management elements of these initiatives cannot be overlooked. If people begin to see these initiatives as purely headcount reduction or a disruption to their daily work, then RPA implementation will not be successful. Here's a quote from Dr. Coopers at DHL. RPA operates at the absolute lowest level of process. It offers you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see the deepest levels of your process, identify deviations from standard, and address them. This goes to exactly what we will be discussing. RPA implementation hinges on your team's understanding of how your business processes operate at a keystroke level. And through that understanding, re-engineering it to make it simpler and easier for the customer, and then ultimately applying RPA to optimize it. Now let's talk about, on a tactical level, some of the elements that will determine RPA implementation success level. I will walk you through what the robot needs in order to be effective, then what some of the common challenges are, and finally recommendations on how to overcome them. Since RPA is taking over repetitive human actions, it needs to take over the logic that it's being used today to complete the task. That means that the robot has to be programmed at a keystroke level. The challenge is that while most of us think that we understand the process or have a process map buried somewhere, chances are that it's not nearly at the accuracy or the detail level required to make sure that the process is RPA ready. The number one rule of RPA implementation is making sure that you understand the process at a keystroke level, and to get there, you have to start mapping in order to understand the details, variation, and interdependencies. The next point is about getting buy-in. The IT organization is essential in setting up a scalable and secure bot infrastructure to plug robots into your existing systems and can hold the key to testing systems, approving user acceptance testing, signing off on go live, and incident management on live systems. In our experience, it can be difficult to move RPA up the priority list of IT organizations when they're often focused on more immediately pressing and large-scale challenges of keeping the lights on, migrating estates to the cloud, and preparing for next-generation ERP. There are three strategies to helping overcome IT buy-in challenge. One is to engage them as soon as possible. Two is to ensure that RPA fits into a larger digital transformation strategy and that it's not just a standalone initiative. And third one is to leverage resources from IT that have an agile background, helping expedite the process. Moving to the next element, let's talk about your people and subject matter experts, as they have all the tribal knowledge on how and why business processes work the way they do. And we will need this insight in order to make sure that we have picked the right process for RPA and that the keystroke level maps do actually reflect reality. The challenge, as we discussed earlier, is that if people begin to see RPA as yet another headcount reduction, they will be less willing to share insight and so the messaging and the change management strategy are critical. People have to believe that RPA is about removing the mundane tasks so that they can focus on the customer value creation activities. And finally, RPA should not really be a standalone strategy for improving customer experience and cost reduction. RPA is just one of the many enablers. On its own, it cannot bring about transformative change, but only incremental improvements. Now that we have some of the learning lessons under our belt, let's talk about the framework for getting RPA implemented. At a high level, think of it as two major phases. Phase one is about designing how the robot will work and making sure it aligns with the larger digital transformation strategy, which is what process architects do. And then phase two is about coding, implementing, and testing to that design, which is where your technology partner and IT resources are more heavily needed. So think of phase one as developing vision and strategy, doing the opportunity assessment, and prioritizing the RPA opportunities. Phase two is designing the code and building, testing, and delivery. I will take you through each of these milestones to discuss key deliverables from each one. The big deliverables around the first milestone really hover around ensuring and appreciating that RPA is, again, only one piece to the larger digital transformation strategy and making sure that it's been leveraged at the right points in the process or life cycle of a transaction. This means that you have already exhausted all options around simplification and process reengineering, and what you're left with can only be further enhanced by RPA. In another way, don't apply RPA to a process that you haven't assessed and reengineered yet. And also understand that if you're applying RPA to multiple points in the process, then perhaps you should also consider a larger workflow system like Boomi. And finally, even though I'm really a process design person, I cannot stress the change management aspect enough as a means of getting the required buy-in from all the key stakeholders and the subject matter experts to minimize backslash. The next three milestones are about process, and more process. Knowing where to apply RPA isn't always going to be obvious. There is actually a method as outlined in this page. The end goal is to find processes within the value streams of a business that bear the greatest cost or take the longest to do. For the highest cost business units, we typically start by outlining the value streams. That's like saying the major buckets of activities that business unit actually does. And then for each of those major buckets, we create an inventory of processes. Once you've done that, then you should come up with a matrix, an RPA prioritization matrix, to determine which processes are ideal candidates for automation. We typically look at parameters like volume, percent reprocess, a complexity rating, number of resources assigned, systems involved, and based on these elements, we can prioritize the ones for RPA. For the most compatible ones, we will then start developing detailed process maps using subject matter expert insight and watching them do the actual work. If after the mapping we still deem the process a good candidate for RPA, then we pursue re-engineering and simplification if needed to guard against applying RPA to a bad process. A bad process for RPA means that it's not repeatable or it's highly complex or customized. Essentially, it's an unstable process. Once the process is cleaned up, meaning it's re-engineered, then we develop a keystroke level map. Think of this as the blueprint for the tech team to assemble the RPA code. Now we know exactly what part of the process we will apply the RPA to and the logic and the code needed to make it work. It's time to hand it over to the technology team and your vendor. Honestly, this is the easiest milestone compared to the last few, because by this point you've done all the heavy lifting, making sure you pick the right part of the process, and that process is streamlined, negating the risk of automating a bad process, and that you have had your subject matter experts validating your keystroke level maps, making sure that it truly reflects how work gets done. Now it's time to build the code, test it, and deploy it into prod environment. The good news is that the coding part has been significantly simplified by most of the technology vendors. It's not so much coding anymore as it's building using modularized platforms. The last thing I will take you through is a real example of how a client applied RPA in order to get incremental efficiency and client experience lift. This is a 50,000-foot level view of a new client experience that we designed for client onboarding. It maps out the vision of how the process and experience is to work from the planning stage with a client all the way to the time that an application is submitted for processing. If you look at the bottom of the page, the design is specifically calling out for a workflow system so that all the data flows from the beginning to end, especially since there are so many different systems involved in onboarding a client. So think of this page as a digital transformation blueprint. It asks for workflow system, an omni-channel capability, a dynamic business rule-based questionnaire to complete an application process that's modularized. It requires e-signature capability. It calls for big data analytics for a quick response on decisions for an application back to the client, and so on. Again, from our perspective, this is the big digital transformation blueprint. But anywhere that you see an asterisk is where we wanted to specifically apply RPA. The main reason being that we knew that not everyone would 100% adopt this digital transformation path for client onboarding. There may be some clients that would still prefer the usage of paper as a means to apply for a new application. In those cases, we would leverage RPA to extract the structured data from the application, the forms, the planning documents, and push it through the system. With this blueprint, we provided the context on how to best leverage each type of technology as well as their roles and expected capabilities in order to better improve client experience and realize efficiencies. In summary, let's recap by mainly focusing on what not to do in order to avoid issues when applying RPA. Do not examine a process in isolation, but instead analyze the entire value stream to determine points of friction and inefficiency. The areas that are highly manual is where you will get the largest ROI. Don't apply RPA to a process as is, but re-engineer the entire process end-to-end to make sure that RPA will be applied to a scalable and repeatable process. And finally, don't leverage RPA as a standalone tool, but create a digital transformation blueprint highlighting the points in the process where RPA would add the incremental value by automation and elimination of manual tasks that otherwise could not be designed out. And finally, here's the criteria checklist for RPA eligibility. If you're considering RPA, make sure that you're selecting a section of the value stream that's high volume, has the lowest level of complexity, is mostly manual, it is a critical step in the process, and the input to the process is highly structured, meaning that the data is, if it's on a form, comes in exactly the same way, and that the process has been simplified and streamlined before the RPA is leveraged for the additional efficiencies. And with that, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us and listening to this presentation on how to make your RPA implementation successful and the milestones to consider when deciding to pursue a journey of RPA. And with that, I will hand it back to our partner, Pablo at ASQ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for taking the time to share this valuable and interesting walkthrough of RPA and its potential for incremental improvement for our membership. It's fantastic. To learn more about Sheila Shaffie and to contact her with all of your questions about this process and how to implement it in your organization, you can email her at sheila.shaffie@ProcessArc.com. You can check out our website for lots more information, examples, and case studies like this at ProcessArc.com. And you can also find one of our most popular publications on ASQ's Quality Press website, and that's the McGraw-Hill 36-hour course, Lean Six Sigma Handbook. And you can also learn about the topic through ASQ. You can go to ASQ's Quality Resource Center, and that's at asq.org/quality-resources. And you can take a look at more webcasts like this at asq.org/quality-resources/webcasts. So thanks again to Sheila and everyone, and we'll have this presentation available online as well as the PDF version and MP4 versions and lots of different versions for you to access. Hope to see you at our next webcast event.